Today, we are going to hear from Shane Bradt. You may have joined us earlier for his first session. This is the second session that's going to be the power of online maps for outreach. Shane comes to us from the University of New Hampshire, where he is responsible for directing the outreach involving geospatial technologies at UNH, Cooperative Extension. He's been teaching these workshops for about 15 years, and Shane has also been a leader of our e-extension community of practice known as Map Assist. And because of this experience and his involvement with e-extension, he has been a key informant for many of our impact collaboratives, and he is also a key informant for many of those activities as we move forward, including this webinar session. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Shane. Thank you.
So welcome to this continuation of a discussion about the way in which maps can be used for outreach. A few weeks ago, we had a webinar specifically about story maps. And this follow-on will talk a tiny bit about story maps, but mostly this is focused on how can you take the actual maps and get them into your story map. So I have a little bit of orientation, introduction, and then most of this webinar will be sort of a hands-on going through and looking how to add and work on maps and create maps and add them into your story maps. And as we started out the other webinar discussing, part of the challenge with using maps is getting the maps to be interesting and also strategic, and also being able to control the maps and display exactly the type of information that you would like to display. Just because you put information on a map doesn't mean somebody's going to find it interesting, or even if they know how to use maps, they may not get out of your data the message that you would like to share with them. So there are plenty of different ways that you can make online maps, but this one we're focusing specifically on if you have made a story map or you're very interested in using ArcGIS Online, which I'll mention in a bit. How do you actually create maps using those platforms? There's a wide variety of others, including Google, which I've shown here, but there are some significant advantages to ArcGIS Online that we will discuss as we go along that make it quite a bit more powerful for sharing information. So as I spoke last time about story maps, and if you haven't know anything about story maps, I suggest you go back and watch that previous webinar. But the idea behind story maps is that, as it says here, everyone has a story to tell. Let's figure out how we can harness maps in order to do that. And I showed a few examples of how this could be done, including probably one of the more famous in the educational world, this Connecticut's Changing Landscape map. And the cool part is that you can combine text and graphics and elements over here on the right with then some sort of interactive map element on the left. But as I mentioned before, and maybe even more importantly than the maps, is that you really have the ability to control and structure your message, which also happens to feature maps. So I've taught a bunch of workshops, done and worked as a key informant, as Ashley had said, given conference presentations, and I often find that people will go back and they will make story maps that have no maps whatsoever. And so this is an example of a story map that was created with about all of the seaweed activities in New Hampshire through New Hampshire Sea Grant and UNH Cooperative Extension, and this one doesn't feature any maps at all. So I'll find folks that'll grasp the idea of a story map, but then later on want to add a map. Or you could just want a map as is. You don't have to necessarily use a story map. I think sometimes there's so much emphasis on story map that people forget there's a lot of other ways to make maps and share information without necessarily going to a story map. So the idea behind this webinar is that you're somebody who's interested in adding a map to a story map, or you're somebody who just wants to make an online map that you can share with people. As I mentioned, the platform that we're talking about is something called ArcGIS Online, which is produced by a company called Esri. There's, as I mentioned, a lot of different options that you could use. Google Maps is one of them. There's probably the only Facebook ad I've ever clicked on for somebody called Mango Maps, and the Facebook ad said, looking for an alternative to ArcGIS Online, try Mango Maps. So this is, certainly ArcGIS Online is not the only way you could do it. And even if you are using story maps, you don't have to use ArcGIS Online for your maps. Story maps have the ability to encapsulate all kinds of other content. And there's an online mapping class that I teach on crowdsourced mapping. And there were folks that used a variety of different mapping platforms and embedded them inside of ArcGIS Online. But from the sake of ease of integration with the story maps, and also because there's so many different powerful features of ArcGIS Online, we're going to focus on that for this presentation. And I'll just stop there to see if there's any questions before I go further, because now I'm going to switch over to actually doing more and showing you how ArcGIS Online works.
No questions at this time.
Okay, great. See if I can get rid of that. Maybe I'll maximize this, that might help. Okay, so when you first open ArcGIS Online, and you can get to ArcGIS Online by going to arcgis.com. When you first get into ArcGIS Online and go to create a new map, this is what you're presented with, sort of this blank template or blank map that you have to add layers to. And sometimes when people start working on maps, they don't understand that concept, that a map is a series of layers that you've added, that you've chosen to display in a certain way, and that creates your actual map. So to start off with in ArcGIS Online, you do have this sort of standard background map. But to me, one of the cool features of ArcGIS Online, which others have similarly, but maybe not to quite the extent of ArcGIS Online, is your ability to change the background map right off the bat. So if you click up here on background map, you'll see that there's a whole series of different maps that ArcGIS Online and Esri provide to be your background map. And I think in a lot of ways, this may not be something you consider in the very beginning, but something to think about as you go along, which background map shows your data off the best. Because a lot of folks will think aerial imagery is great, or topography is great. But really, when it comes down to it, the amount of information shown in aerial imagery or topography might hide your data. So there are strategic ways to choose the background map, which we can talk about in a bit. But keep in mind, the background map provides context for your map, but really the thing you want to show in your map are your data. And other competing platforms, there are definitely choices. I think there's a few more choices here. And again, you don't have to know anything other than, oops, I'd like imagery, and be able to click it and make a change. So one of the things about ArcGIS Online that's really interesting, and it can be a bit challenging, but interesting, is that there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can add data to the map. If you notice over here, there's this add button, and if you click on add, you have a variety of ways you can add it, and we'll go over some of these, not all of these in this webinar, but some of them. But interesting right away is this search for layers. And the beautiful thing about searching for layers is you don't have to know anything at all about GIS or have produced or made any GIS data to start searching and adding information. So you can notice up here it says find, and we have my organization, and depending on how you're logged in, it might start with my organization. But really what we want to do is go and look at something called ArcGIS Online. So ArcGIS Online started sort of as a Dropbox for map data, where years ago they used to just be able to put your data up and share it with people. And it turns out to be something that is a strong feature of ArcGIS Online, that anybody can post and share GIS data that they've produced. So if you're looking for data for a specific purpose, let's say you're looking for wildfire, make a map about wildfire, you can just put wildfire into here and then click go, and it'll search through all of the data layers online and pull out anything that either starts with or has wildfire in the name or in any of the descriptions. Now, you may notice that there's a whole bunch of different layers, and as part of the wonderful world of everybody can contribute data to something, everybody can contribute data to something, and so it takes a bit of research for you to figure out perhaps which one of these wildfire data layers could work the best for you. And part of it could just be adding it and seeing what it looks like. So let's go ahead and add this. And so right away, within seconds, I looked for wildfire, I found data, and I was able to add it. But before you add the data, you might say to yourself, well, what exactly are these, what does this data represent? Who produced it? Cool part about ArcGIS Online is you can simply click on the name of that data layer, and it pops open a little description, which of course in the GIS world, called metadata. And metadata, I think, is a less foreign concept to people than it was before, but metadata has always been important in the GIS world. And part of the issue with a lot of the other programs that are out there is you have no way to look for information about where the data came from, who produced it, or a description of it. So this is pretty powerful, where you can click and find out. This is information. You can see who produced it, a brief summary. And then if you want even more information, you can click on item details, and it opens up this page where it has description about who produced it, sort of what use variables there are, and gives you a lot more information, potentially. Now, sometimes the people who produce the data don't bother to fill out this page or don't fill it out well, and that would probably give you a little inkling of whether or not the data are useful to you. But this sort of option to be able to then investigate and see who produced the data and what they're about and what the data contain, I think, is really powerful before you add the data. Now, once you add the data, and you click done adding data layers, you then can control various elements of your map. You can turn things on and off. You can see what the legend looks like. Sort of simple, but fairly easy to look and add data. If you ever want to go back to adding data, so you want to find something else to add on top of it, you can go back to add and then search for layers and go back to ArcGIS Online. So perhaps we want to look for boundaries. Let's see if I can find something. And Esri has a bunch of data layers, as you might expect, sort of world boundaries and places or US counties. See what happens with that if we add it on. And we'll put world boundaries and places. And done adding layers. And right away, of course, you'll see that sometimes, oh boy, here it comes, that some data can draw very, very slowly depending on the size. So let's just get rid of those for now. And you can see that this world boundaries and places has provided some basic information about the different states. One of the cool things, of course, about using other people's data online is that when you zoom in, they've decided already for you what data are going to be available. So for example, here we see the state capital and the state itself, and also maybe a few other towns like Nashua, New Hampshire, and Lowell in Massachusetts. And then when you zoom in closer, more information becomes available. So you've never thought about this necessarily yourself as if you've used traditional GIS in desktop, or you have thought about it but ignored it because you're only looking at one version of the data. In the online world, as you zoom in and out, it's going to be very important which information displays when. And so if you can find data layers that other people have produced that work well for you, then maybe you can save yourself a lot of time and effort in creating that map. So again, just go to add, search for layers, and spend some time looking around. It can be challenging to find what you need depending on what it is that you need. It may be that the things you need don't exist, but this is a really good way for you to at least explore to see whether or not some of the data layers you'd like to have in your map already exist, people have made them available, and you can use them without having to do anything other than find them and add them to your map. So let me remove a few of these. We don't really need these for the next step. So what if you have your own data that you'd like to add to the map? There's a couple of different ways that you can add it. If you have it on your computer, you can add data straight into the map. So we'll go down here to add a layer from file. And when you bring up this dialog, it says, it displays to you various options for you to put in your data. So first one on the list is something called a shapefile. And if you are a GIS user, you know what a shapefile is. You basically take all the files that can constitute a shapefile and put them in a zip folder. Also, though, if you go to a state GIS database, and for example, in New Hampshire, it's New Hampshire Granite, when you download the data, they come as zip files. So I downloaded a eelgrass database from actually 2001 and 2010. It came already as a zip file that I could upload straight into ArcGIS Online. Now, as you can see, that there are a certain amount of data limitations. You can't have, every single, people get very interested in having tax parcels and putting all their tax parcels up. There is a certain amount of data that Esri will allow you to upload into the map. And part of it is just based on what works well online. I know that Google has a similar limitation of 1,000 features, and you can see that some of them also have no limitations. You have to play around with what the best way to get your data up. But there's two ways I'll just show you as a quick demonstration. One is a shapefile, which GIS people know, or you can get from your state clearinghouse, as long as it's not too big, and also a CSV file or a text file. Now, a CSV file is something that anybody can produce, and they can be complicated or they can be fairly easy, and that's the first one that I'll go ahead and use. And all a CSV file is, as you can see, there's a comma or tab or semicolon or tab delimited file. Now, you can produce those with any spreadsheet. So if you have your data in Excel or Access or anything like that, when you save as, CSV or something like CSV will be an option. So I have one CSV file that I'm going to go ahead and add just to show you. And click Import Layer. And it went ahead and added my critters layer to the map. And my critters layer are hypothetical wildlife sightings of many things, either cryptozoological, so things that don't exist or that probably shouldn't exist in New Hampshire, like platypus. So right away, it took the information, it put it on the map. Now, it might be subtle, and I'll show you in a little more detail in a second, but it automatically knew which of these points was yeti, jackalope, chupacabra, and platypus, and colored them appropriately. And one of the reasons it can do that is because GIS is really a database that happens to make maps. So underneath this data layer is both the location, latitude, longitude, but also there is a column for species and a column for number. And how I set that up pretty simply in a CSV file is just to make an Excel file that looks like this: lat, long, species, and number. Now, just so you notice, there is one row on the top. The names have no spaces or strange characters in them, and then the data start immediately below and are the same type of data throughout. But as long as you follow those rules and your latitude and longitude are formatted correctly, you can have as many columns on here as you want. And just notice quickly, latitude and longitude are formatted based on decimal degrees, so 43.362 on and on. Longitude the same, and also it has a negative in front of it because west and south in decimal degrees are negative. So as long as you format your lat and long and the information this way, you can quickly just go and add it straight to your map, and it displays no problem. So one of the things I'm going to do right now to show you, and this is maybe a bit on the personal preference side, but I really like having these light gray and dark gray background maps, because it then provides context for your data without competing against it. So right now, I don't care if there's a background image to see where the Yeti are in New Hampshire. I just want the subtle outlines of New Hampshire. And as in the case with the other maps, as you zoom in, somebody's made a decision about at what level do you see certain information? Do you have roads and names of roads? And so I really like to use those. And specifically, I really love this dark gray canvas. So let me go ahead and zoom out. So what if you then wanted to control what this looked like? Again, because it's GIS, you have a fairly easy time of that. And because you have the real data in the database behind it, you can act on things. So for example, if you'd like a heat map of locations where there's more sightings, you can click on the heat map. And that automatically does and displays a heat map. Or if you would just say, well, I don't need a heat map, but instead I would like to show these dots are kind of small, I'd like them to be different, you can go ahead and click on options. And this does look a little bit complex, but again, it's not too difficult. Or you can click here to change the symbol for each one of these. So if I wanted the Yeti to be bigger or a different color, or use a different icon, there are lots and lots of different possibilities. Now, I will say using the icon sounds like a good idea. Sometimes once you start to really go ahead and dig in and have all of these icons floating on the page, it doesn't work that well. But you have a lot of capability to change it, or if you notice down here, you can use your own image. As I said, your mileage may vary on this, but it's worth giving it a shot.
Shane,
are there any questions so far? Yes.
I actually have a question. So what's the trick of the trade to determine your latitude and longitude? I mean, what you presented seems very straightforward, but how do I actually make sure I have the correct coordinates?
Well, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. If you have no other way to do it, I would just install Google Earth on your computer, or now the new version of Google Earth, you don't even need to install it. And if you go in Google Earth on your computer, wherever your cursor is located, or if you put a point down, it gives you the latitude and longitude for it. So if you already have Google Earth on your computer, that would be what I would do. There's lots of different ways that you can do it, but for a lot of people, I think that's pretty straightforward.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yep. Now notice that this is critters because I chose to show the number of species, but also I have the number of critters located at each location. So I could very easily say, all right, let me have bubbles that pop up that show the size of the bubbles based on the number that located. Because there's real GIS data behind the scenes, which GIS data sound complicated, but it's really just this. You can go ahead and make that map really easily. And this is something, again, that's tougher to do in non-GIS mapping software. The other thing that's interesting is why not do both? Why not have the species be shown perhaps by color, and then you can add an attribute and show it also by number. So this, again, is fairly easy to do because the software is designed very specifically to interact with and display data in this way. Now, there's lots of customization you can do. You can go in and make changes in all of those things. But again, going from no data on your map to this is fairly straightforward. And just as a quick aside, to rebuild that, all I have to do is add layer from file, click on CSV. There's my critters file, which is waiting. Import the layer and say I'd like to show species, and also I'd like to show it by number. And as long as you're okay with those default settings, you're done. There's your map that you can show to people. Again, if you'd like to make the changes, there are tons of changes that you can make. If you don't like the color scheme or the sizes, or you made a mistake with the typing and you'd like to fix it, you can do that easily. So this, if you're making a story map, could be one of the components that you add to your story map. So I went ahead and save this. And I'm going to call this Critters of New Hampshire. Say one of the strange things, as I mentioned last week, is that everything in this system wants you to use a tag. And if you try to save things without a tag, it won't let you save them. So my suggestion to folks is come up with a tag that you can use always, and I just use my initials to make sure if I have nothing else to put in for tags, I can put that. If you like tags and you know how they're used and you have a system, great. And if not, just pick one that you use all the time. And go ahead and save this map. So if I wanted to add this map to a story map, so here, going back from last week, here's this map journal story map that I've created. Once you go in here, one of the options that you have is to add your map as content. You say map. You have the option to create a map or select a map. If you select a map, it goes into your ArcGIS Online account, finds whatever you've built, and you can just select it. And it adds it in there. So any changes that you make in this map, of course, will be updated in your story map as well. So if we're back here and we said, no, I don't like the dark gray, I'd like the light gray instead, and you resave the map. I'm going to go back to your story map and save it. Probably going to have to reload the page in order for it to show up with the new version. But the map is automatically updated. So every time somebody would go to your story map and refresh the page, the map would show the latest version of the map. So it's fairly straightforward if you keep everything internal to ArcGIS Online. Now, if you don't keep everything internal to ArcGIS Online and you want to put a map in your story map, when you're adding that information, you would instead embed the map. So if you go to Add Section, there's this web page. If you're using Google Maps or you're using crowd map or something else, you would treat that map as a web page that you're embedding as opposed to embedding a map. So in a story map, this thing that says map is considered to be an ArcGIS Online map. So that's one of the reasons the story maps are so powerful, because all of this, the map making and the storytelling, are all integrated into one. So any questions on that before we move forward?
There is one question that was submitted. You just mentioned that you can find your maps in your ArcGIS account. Is this account free?
I will talk at the end about that. So it's the funny thing is, I've had people ask me, I've even put a slide in about this, about, well, I have a story map account. Can I also get an ArcGIS Online account? So your ArcGIS Online account is a story map account, and your story map account is an ArcGIS Online account. So there is a whole story map interface, which we covered last time at storymaps@arcgis.com. The same user and login gets you into both of these. And I'll talk about that just at the very end. Short answer, yes, there is a free account that you can get and use, and you can do tons and tons of stuff with it. There are a few limitations we'll mention, but for a lot of the story mapping or the map creation part of things, the free account you can do an incredible amount with. I happen right now to be logged into my account through the university because I always do all my demonstrations through it, but you could do everything I've shown and everything I'm going to show for the rest of this time, you can do inside of a free account. Okay.
And just also to point out that Don Jackson shared that Google Sheets has an add-on, Geocode by Awesome Table rather, that will batch calculate latitude and longitude.
Ooh, good to know. Yeah, because one of the things I didn't mention, of course, is what if you have addresses? And that gets into this idea of geocoding and taking physical, so addresses, mailing addresses, and putting them on the Earth. And I think that's what Don is referring to, if I'm not mistaken. And that, there's a bunch of different ways to do geocoding. ArcGIS Online can do geocoding, but as Don mentioned, and as you look around, there are lots of different ways you can do it. Often it'll cost some money unless you do it in small quantities and are patient, but to get that lat and long, if you have addresses, that would be, I hope that that link is visible for people, but also there would be other ways that you could do that. And you could, if you have a paid account, and that's one of the differences here, do lat and long from addresses inside of ArcGIS Online as well.
There is another question that just popped in from Jay. Is there
Sure.
a way to create a map as an imaginary or fantasy map, i.e. to create a type of game for the users?
Sure. I mean, there's really no limitation to what sort of map you could create. The only tricky thing is that the map has to exist, at least in the normal standard ArcGIS Online, it has to exist somewhere on the Earth. So there's every point has to have a known location on the face of the Earth. So if you had a fantasy map and you wanted to make it, in Middle Earth from Tolkien, there's no show me the Middle map or Middle Earth globe or area and let me put it on there. So you'd have to pick somewhere on the face of the Earth. But otherwise, yeah, you could. There's no limitation to what you could put on it.
And before we leave our critters, Stephanie asked, can you click on one of the critters and then have them pop up that describes the critter and its habitat? There you go.
Of course. Yep. So this is the standard default. Shane's done nothing to change what the pop-ups look like version of it. And this is just based, if you remember back to this is just drawing exactly what it says from here. So you could edit it here if you didn't want it to say lat and long, you wanted to say something different. You can also, inside of ArcGIS Online, go ahead and edit what this pop-up is going to look like. So if you go back here, well, number one, you can remove the pop-ups because this is an important point. Sometimes you don't want people to be able to get to the information. I imagine that folks could come up with ways in which they want to have a map with data but don't want the data to be accessible directly. Or you can configure pop-up, and I believe you can also get to that same screen here. Oh no, sorry, that's editing that point. Let me get out of this. Go back to configure pop-up, and it allows you to control how it's going to be shown. And I won't go into too much detail here because it can get a bit complex when you get down. But for example, if you didn't want latitude and longitude to show, you can just turn them off. And if you wanted species to say sort of monsters, for example, you could change it here and then click OK. So when you click on these points, the pop-up would be different. Now keep in mind, this isn't editing the underlying base data. This is just saying, hey, for this map, when people click, I want it to look like this. And that's powerful too, because often you'll have a whole bunch of data in a data layer, and you might not want people to be able to access all of it, partially maybe because you don't want them to see the data, and also you don't want them distracted. And I think part of the idea of using this light gray background is similar to the idea of controlling what's in the pop-up. Okay, maybe latitude and longitude is something you're fine with them seeing. But if the point is just to show what species is there in the pop-up, you want to get rid of lat and long because you don't want people distracted by it. So yes, lots of ways to control it, and there's even more ways and more control you have if you want to spend time on it. But even just the basic sort of hover, click here, go to configure pop-ups, you have the ability to change a lot of things. Okay. So then the last thing, or the other type of data I wanted to show quickly is a shapefile. There's lots of folks might have shapefiles, and I find it often an extension. You'll have people that have gotten data from people, have shapefiles, don't know how to use desktop GIS, or someone in the office used to know how to use it, but they're not around anymore, or the software is old and won't install on the newest computer. So you can go ahead and add data from that file as well. So here are two examples of GIS files that I just downloaded straight from the New Hampshire GIS Clearinghouse. One of them is eelgrass distribution from 2001, and one is 2010. Let's go ahead and import those data. And to make it a little bit easier, I'm going to go back and turn off the critters before I start getting into this. So here is the eelgrass distribution for this estuarine area back in 2001. And right now, the colors are being displayed by the size of the patches of eelgrass. You can see that it's darker, it has bigger size patch, and lighter is a smaller patch. But just like with the critters, you have different characteristics of those eelgrass patches. And one of interest here is density. So it shows within a given patch, how dense is the patch. And you might see this SBHDP and 0. What does that mean? This is something you run into all the time with GIS data. And often it's just to keep the data themselves simple. And this is a very big lesson for people working with GIS data, especially those who are not familiar with it. When you get information from people, you got to ask, where are the metadata? What do they mean? And so, for example, on Granite's website, for every data layer they have this big, ugly, sorry, don't mean ugly, I mean very complex metadata layer. But if you search enough, you can find in the middle of it what those values mean. I sort of pulled them out in a simpler version, and this is what those letters mean. So dense, some, bottom, half, partial, and present. And I think the 0, to be honest, is a mistake in the data. So you might want to say, well, these make a lot more sense to me and to my users than all these other things. So D, dense, some, bottom, half, and partial, you can go ahead and change those in the way that you're displaying the data by clicking on here and saying, instead of the label, we have some, bottom, oops. Yes, enter. It's not going to let me do it at the moment. Why is that? Oh, that was a bit odd. Some, bottom. Oh, I think it might be the tab, half. Tab. That's very odd. Half. Dense. Partial. And one would say, of course, these are kind of a strange order, so I would probably take dense and put it up on the top. Can't remember the order of those. Let's see. Dense, some, bottom, half, partial. Dense, some, bottom, half, partial. This is a mistake in the data. I'm not really sure why they have that, but this I'm going to put unknown. So now your legend makes some sense instead of just having D, SB, H. And this is important when you're using GIS data. How do you transition between one and the other? Between what a GIS person would think and what a non-GIS person would think. So I'm going to add one second one in from 2010. And I'm going to wind up doing the same thing quickly here, using the same colors. It is a bit odd that it's not letting me have to get out each time. And this is let's see. Okay. And as you see, this is part of the joy of GIS, is that you're going to have to go back and make sure that all of these are the same color if you want them, obviously, to be the same. And for the sake of time, we're not going to do that with this, although maybe I could do it. Oh, no, some. Yeah. Instead, just for the next step here. So are there any questions so far in this? Because I'm going to do one other change to show you. I mean, I want to have any questions before I go forward on that. So you can see bringing the data in and manipulating it's fairly easy to figure out, okay, which order do they come in? Are they all the same color? Would take a little time, but it's just a matter of going through the steps here in this diagram, or sorry, these option boxes. If you use GIS, these look very familiar. If you haven't used GIS, they may not be as familiar, but if you spend a little bit of time and know your data, and that's part of the tricky involvement in any map, is understanding what your data are and what you'd like to display.
There's
no questions?
No questions at this time.
Okay, great. So I'm going to undo what I just did by setting them all to be what's called, I'm just going to show location only, which means they're all going to be the same color. Because for this example, I don't want them to have all of these variety of colors. I'm going to change this color from this orange to something different, so maybe this purple. So I have this map showing eelgrass in 2001, eelgrass in 2010. And a lot of map presentations allow you to do this and come up with a way to layer different data layers on top of each other. Again, this is with real GIS data. And you might say, well, this looks a little bit ugly when I zoom in. A couple of quick things that I would suggest is I usually try to get rid of the outline. And part of the reason I get rid of the outline is that can be a little bit, there can be lots of different boundaries that are shown that don't really need to be shown. 2010, and then the 2001.
While you're doing that, Shane, Cable's asked, can these maps be downloaded and inserted into a slideshow?
Yes, of course. So any of these maps, so there's a couple of things. One, there's always a way that you can print or export the maps. So there's a print dialog box, which I'll have to say isn't great, but I'll go ahead and print it just so you can see what it looks like. So you could do it from here, and it takes a little while, and it loads the map, and you can control, excuse me, what it looks like. But I would say any of these maps can be downloaded by just taking a screenshot. So if you have your map looking the way you'd like here, I would just take a screenshot of it. And on the Mac, there's a screenshot program called Grab that comes with every computer, and on the PC, there's another. Depends on how it's set up. Also, the print screen button, if you have an older keyboard or even a newer one, you might have print screen, that copies and actually takes a screenshot. So you can go ahead and paste those into PowerPoint or Word, or put them into some image editing program like Photoshop or something and save them. I would say most of the time with online maps, they're not made to print really well or export, but because you can take a screenshot of anything on your computer, you can take that screenshot and then use it however you'd like to use it. So the last little bit here is just talking about how would you like to then be able to share this map? And I think That's one of the way that ArcGIS Online excels. So, if you have a story map like this one here, you can embed your map in a story map. So let me go back and reload this. Since we've reconfigured the page, remember I saved it as the same name here. This is still Critters of New Hampshire. That map has then been updated. Also notice if you'd like to create a map right within your story map, so you want to add a new section with a new map, one of the options is select a map, but there's another one that says create a map. So we'll say next step in demo. Oops. You don't even have to go to ArcGIS Online necessarily. Now the story map interface pokes a hole in the page and gives you that same exact data or mapping interface. It used to be you had to go to ArcGIS Online. You had to leave your story map, go over to ArcGIS Online, then come back to your story map. Now, again, if you want to add a map, you can just click Create Map, and it'll give you that interface right here in the story map itself. But even if you don't want a story map and you just want to use that map, there are various ways that you can use it. One is once you save it, I'm going to save this again. And actually, use my dark gray. I like that. Save it again, and you can click on this share dialog. So there's a variety of ways you can share it. One of them is to share it publicly so that everybody can see it. And you can, if you send people this link to the map, they will be able to get there. You don't have to do anything else. They won't have to know anything about ArcGIS Online or have an account since you've made it public. You can also embed it in your website by clicking on the Embed in Website. And you see up here, you can set the size that you want it, and there's a whole bunch of different options. Do you want a scale bar or not? Do you want zoom control or not? Do you want to have people to be able to see the map details or a legend? And as you're making these changes here, it then takes this code, which is up here, and creates it so that you can embed it in a website. And if you know enough about your website and you have access to it, you can go ahead and put it in yourself. If you don't, you can just copy this, maybe paste it into a text file and send it to the person who does control your website and say, listen, I want this map embedded in this page, and here's the text for it, the code. And once that's embedded, again, just like in a story map, any changes you make to your map in ArcGIS Online will automatically be shown in that embedded map. So you just have to do this embed once, assuming you don't want to change any of these settings, and you can just go ahead and manage your map inside of ArcGIS Online, and every time somebody comes to your web page, a new version of that will be shown based on the latest version of your map. But the thing that's the most different, of course, is this creation of a web app. And that is where you can get into things like story maps. But notice there's not just story maps. There's a whole bunch of different types of web apps that you can use. So a web app is just a simple sort of a wrapper of a prettier looking version of your map that in the past used to require a good deal of coding. And right now you can do it with no coding whatsoever. So I'm just going to make a quick web app, which is something with type that we talked about last week, which is a story map. But it doesn't really matter which one it is, a story map or a web app, because they're really one and the same. But let's say I wanted people to be able to compare those layers. So I want people to have two different maps. On the left, I want one of those layers, and on the right, I want another. I can select them here, or I can just say, you know what? I'd like to be able to hide and reveal one of the data layers in a current map. Again, you have settings here. These are all based on just clicking through dialog boxes. I think it's 2001, 2010. And since you've already created your map, all you have to do is say this map here, or in the case that I used here, hey, one of the layers in the map I want to be able to hide and reveal. And then it's just a matter of configuring your map the way you'd like it to display. So if I want to have information here, if I want the legend there or not, whatever it is that I want, I can control with no coding because I've made the maps already. And if I save this, I can then share it with people. And I can go to another software that's not logged into ArcGIS Online. This. And this is the map that I can send to people. So they don't have to know anything about ArcGIS Online at all. They just have to be able to have that specific link. And they can view your data and access the map. Now, in order to make the map look nicer, you'd have to spend a little bit more time thinking through it. What do we want here? Do we even want a legend? How do we want to display it? But once you've created your map, it's that easy to turn it into this web app or a slicker version of these maps that you can send out to people, and they don't have to know anything about ArcGIS Online. You can configure a lot of these things, the name, the text here. We'll just show you, of course, that you can configure the different colors of the theme. If you have specific colors you have to use, you can get rid of the logo, put your own logo in. There's lots of ways that you can configure this, and all without having any coding ability, just making your maps in ArcGIS Online, choosing which one of these web apps you want to use, and then spending enough time to consider, how do I want this exactly to look? Now, it's not infinitely configurable because it does constrain you in certain ways, but one of the things I always ask people is, how would you do it otherwise if you weren't using this? And for most people, especially an extension, we might have a little bit of coding, but that's probably not something that a lot of people do, and a lot of people have no coding ability. So the fact that you can do this after making a few maps and get something fairly quickly done that looks pretty impressive, I think more than makes up for the fact that you can't necessarily control every single finite element of it. But that being said, there's lots and lots of control that you have. Okay. So web apps, there's a lot of different types. If we had a whole webinar just about web apps, we could go through all of those, but I'm just going to stop here and see if there's any questions.
There is a question from Robert. Yep. Can a map be shared to a mobile device as well as a desk or laptop computer?
Yes, and one of the things about these web apps, and let me see where it went. Oh, that's right, I used it in Firefox. Let me get back there. Is that they're responsive automatically, so they know the size of the device that they're on. So if you grab it and start stretching it, at some point it'll change. So this is what that same map would look like on a mobile phone. And you can see that it changed. So up here it has legend, map, and data. So if you want to see the legend, you have to click over here in the map. Sorry, this is sized the wrong way. Legend. No, sorry, since it was such a simple version, it's not as impressive to look at this. But yes, you can see that it switched over and it realizes, based on this screen size, I'm on a phone, and on a phone, I should look like this. And as it gets bigger and bigger, it says, oh, I must be on a tablet. Okay, now I'm on a desktop, and it changes the way that the map works. So all of these, both the web maps, so if you just made the simple map itself, or these more complex versions, the web apps, are responsive and will change according to the size of the device. If you embed the web map, it will try to change. One of the things that I glossed over very quickly, let's do it before we run out of time here, is when you do the embedding of the map down here, it does say allow responsive sizing. So if you'd like it to do its best to look good on a mobile device, you need to include that. Keep in mind, if you have a responsive website and then you embed a map inside of it that's trying to be responsive, your mileage may vary on how exactly that looks, but it does have that capability to be flexible. All right. So there's lots of other things we could talk about, but that's sort of the total amount of stuff that I wanted to cover. I will say the last few slides here are very quick, which is just, well, what if you want an ArcGIS Online account? There's two ways to get one. One is you click on this nice orange button in the middle, which says Try ArcGIS. That's really just option A, though. When you click on Sign In up here, you get to two different versions. So if you click on the Try ArcGIS, you sign up for a 60-day free trial of their paid version. If you click on the Sign In the upper right, you can get to this place where it says a public account. So the one on the bottom, the public account, is free. It does say, of course, that it's personal account meant for non-commercial use, but you can make a ton of maps. You can make pretty much any story map as long as there's not data collection involved. Any story map, you can make all of those web app templates. There's very little limitation about basic mapping and how you can share information. The big differences between these two are privacy. So if you have a paid version, you have a lot of control. You could see, you might not have noticed, but you can see when I shared it, it gave me the ability to share it with the public or inside my organization or with different groups. And so with the paid account, you get that ability to have multiple users, have different groups, which is great, so that only certain people can see certain data and certain maps. You don't get that with the free account. You can shield things with the free account, but it's either shielded or visible. There's no in between. If you wanted to do analysis, you wanted to do buffering, or you wanted to do any sort of merging of data or processing that you would normally do in desktop GIS, you can do that in the paid version. You cannot do that in the free version. And the other one of mobile mapping, so creating different ways for people to go out with their phones and add data to your map, either real time or once they've synced through Wi-Fi. You can do that with the paid account. You cannot do it with the free public account. But that being said, with those stipulations, the free public account can do a tremendous amount. And especially if you want to try this, there's no reason not to sign up for a public account. You can go and get one in like a minute and then try this out and see if you like it. If you're at a university, you probably already have access to one of the ArcGIS Online accounts at your university, the paid version through the site license, if you just ask for it. And most people I've talked to have gone back to the university. As long as they can find the right person to ask, they can get an account. I have one that I run for UNH Cooperative Extension. I actually paid a little bit of extra money in our site license to get one that's exclusive to us, but it wasn't a tremendous amount of money. If you are a nonprofit, it's $100 a year. You can also, if you'd like, one of the lowest you can get as a nonprofit is $100 a year. And also there's a home use edition, which is $100 a year. So if you wanted to just try out the full version, you could do the 60-day free trial. But if you also then wanted to say, all right, I'm going to try this for longer, you have access to it for $100 a year. So if you want to get started, the free public one is great. Everything I did in the last webinar on story maps and everything I've done in this one, you can definitely do with the free public account. Just a couple of last things for quick resources. If you want to see what the efforts are from our community, as Ashley mentioned in the beginning, of geospatial technology folks in Extension, we have a new website, went up about a year ago, the Map Assist website. We're trying to get information about how people are using mapping for outreach and engagement up there, and then resources for folks, including this webinar, are there. And if you have any information or questions, you can contact me directly using that information on top. And all of the websites I mentioned in the webinar today are listed there at the bottom. Except I skipped over one. The GISworkshops.org is my training center website here. If you happen to be in New England or in New Hampshire, information about what we're doing through Cooperative Extension in New Hampshire is at that GISworkshops.org. Guess that slide got left off. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, there's a question about where to find the previous webinar, and that is actually in Learn at learn.extension.org. And I'll put another link in the chat window for you to that session. And then I just laid in a link to this session where the recording can be found in a few days. And just discovered that there is some glitch today with our post-webinar survey. So I encourage you to go back to the recording event and take a look at that survey. And we may actually send that out via email to try to capture your thoughts on today's session. I'm not sure what's happening with Qualtrics, but you know, sometimes those things happen. So, any other questions for Shane?
Shane, I'm wondering about sharing your own data. You mentioned that those data layers that are sort of publicly available, is it pretty straightforward if you want to sort of use that as a vehicle to get your own data out there? If you know a colleague is using ArcGIS Online, and you know, is that a sort of a way to do it, is to make that layer publicly available within ArcGIS and allow them to just grab it from there?
Oh yeah, maybe that's something even could be a different webinar where we focus on just how do you get your data up there and make it available. So you saw quickly how I added data by just putting it into my map. When it did that behind the scenes, it was putting that data inside of my account. So you have a lot of control both over the web app, the map you made, and the data layer to see which one of those are available and to who. You can make it available publicly. You can make it available to only people in your organization or just people in different groups. So yeah, by posting it there and making it public, anybody who searches for it that hits the right keywords will be able to find it. That also means you need to be aware when you put data in your map that people might be able to find your data by searching directly for the data. So think about how you list things once they're put up. The other thing is, if you have desktop GIS, ArcGIS, it's very integrated with ArcGIS Online. So a lot of folks that want to publish data for the organization, for example, might have one person who has ArcGIS on ArcGIS desktop. They'll create the data, manage it, deal with it in that, and then they'll publish it to ArcGIS Online and make it available for other people. But even if you don't have the desktop, just even doing what it was that we were doing, and then going behind the scenes a little bit to change some settings, you can make those data available to anybody, or just people inside your organization, or just people in specific groups inside your organization, if you have the fancier version of the account.
Cool.
And I think you sort of covered some of this, but I do want to make sure. Stephanie has asked the panelists, do you know the cost of a paid account? Does each person need their own account? And are we using with a group of students? Would each person need their own account, or would the school be able to get a single account?
Can you just quickly get what type of students? Are they university students or K through 12? Or I guess I'll just answer that anyway. But if you're a K through 12 school, any school can get a free version of the advanced kind, and it will come with as many users as you need. If you're going to be inside of a university site license, they have lots of different levels. I specifically bought one just for cooperative extension under our site license. At the time, it cost me $500 a year, and it had 100 users. And I think the users have gone up since then. It'll depend on your site license specifically. But if it's related to students, it's usually fairly inexpensive, or free if it's K through 12. If you're a business, then it's going to be a different metric, and I'm not familiar with it. They would suggest for those folks that they get in touch directly with Esri or do some research on their own. But with students, it's usually minimal. You might already have it, or as I said, for 100 users a few years ago, it cost me $500 a year to have that. But the way they sell it is different amounts of money get you different amount of users. And under your university site license, you might not even have to pay. And Esri's changing the rules as they go along with these. So it might even be that I might not have to pay in the future. I wanted our own account, so I controlled everything inside of it, and nobody from outside of extension was in it. But often people go back and just say, hey, I'm teaching a student. I have 20 students in my class for this semester. You know, IT people of the university give me their accounts. And I know at UNH that's happening because we've been pushing for it. So supposedly in the fall, students who are enrolled in classes, academic courses that are using ArcGIS Online will be able to get accounts. I'm meeting with somebody in a few weeks to see if that actually happened, but that's just under the normal site license with no additional cost as part of the academic technology support at the university. But I don't know in each university how it's set up. If you have specific questions about that, feel free to get in touch with me afterwards and I can try to help you.
If there's no other questions, thank you, Shane, so much for all this information, and thanks to everyone for sharing what they know about this process, and look forward to seeing some new maps out there.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ashley.
Thanks,
Thank
Mark.
you.
Bye-bye.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.